Okay, then we start up again with part 3 of this lecture on security risks and terrorism. And now we move on to the evolving terrorist threat to luxury hotels, which is kind of a case study. And it's an extension of the focus on the relationship between terrorism and international business, both indirect impacts and direct impacts. And firstly, 9/11, 2001, terrorist attacks in the US by Al-Qaeda changed international business concerns about terrorism. It changed a lot of things. US foreign policy, it changed the perceived risk of terrorism among international businesses. It changed domestic societies, excuse me, and it inaugurated a period where the risk of jihadist terrorist attacks were quite heightened, helped by the war in Afghanistan, and in particular helped by the war in Iraq, which and by the Arab Spring later in 2010-2011. 9/11 had an enormous impact on business. And it has to be said again and repeated that these attacks were spectacular. They were a huge success seen from the viewpoint of the group, Al-Qaeda. It is probably something that is extremely difficult to replicate in terms of coordination and in terms of executing the attack, planning the attack without being detected. So it comes as a huge shock, and it has, of course, direct effects. 40 billion is a number mentioned here, $40 billion in direct insurance losses. You lost buildings in the World Trade Centers, two huge buildings. So all these direct effects it's easy to understand that there's a lot of direct effects in that situation. And of course, airlines experience huge losses because these hijackers, these terrorists, they hijacked 4 planes. And now people question immediately, is it safe to fly? And the US closes its airspace right after this. And everything is in turmoil, and you have these uncertainties and these heightened perceptions of risk, which lingers on, and it's not a case, and we see that with the coronavirus as well. The expectations are that this will have long-term effects on airlines, tourism industry, and it was certainly the same with 9/11. And one asked the question at the time, is this going to be the norm now? Is this a one-off attack, or is this the start of something far more serious and sinister? Businesses experienced worldwide disturbance of operations, communications disruptions, and it was far more difficult to conduct transatlantic air traffic. Borders were closed and often heavily secured and scrutinized. We have something which we can call, in a colloquial term, interdependence risk. A lot of indirect, lingering, long-term effects by 9/11. And once again, a terrorist attack is often not, the effects are often not limited to the people actually being impacted at the time in the attack. There's a lot of indirect effects, a lot of psychological effects here as well. Okay. So 9/11 changes things. And if we move over to the hotels specifically, the evolving terrorist threat to luxury hotels, these are, of course, as many terrorist attacks are, not all, but many are low probability, high impact events. You have the opposite as well in terms of terrorism. Kidnappings, for instance, are high probability events in many areas. And you can call them high impact if you take the viewpoint of the victims. But they're not high impact in terms of changing domestic society or international politics or international business fundamentally. In fact, kidnappings, sometimes they evolve into a routine question for businesses, which is to say that you expect that some of your employees somewhere down the line will be kidnapped if you're in high-risk areas. And then you have this sort of a paradox that these companies, they pay the kidnappers, the terrorists, the armed groups to get their employees back. They pay a ransom. It can be millions of US dollars. And from an individual company viewpoint, that's perfectly rational. You don't want to lose your employees. You don't want them to lose their lives. So you pay, and they're released, often at least. So it's, from the company's point of view, it's rational. From the business community point of view, it's irrational. From a group point of view, collective point of view, it's irrational because it strengthens the problem. If kidnappers, if terrorist groups, rebels can make money, know they can make money from kidnapping, they know that companies usually pay up or their insurers pay up, then you have even more incentive to continue kidnapping. But these are low impact. It's fair to describe them as at least low or medium impact events. High probability in some areas. These large-scale terrorist attacks against luxury hotels and against, hardened targets in the US, they're high-impact events, but low probability. They don't often happen. So we have the Mumbai attacks, which is perhaps a background story for this article in question, the Mumbai attacks in 2008, which was a coordinated, sophisticated attack by a Pakistani group, it seems Lashkar-e-Taiba, which is linked, or was linked rather, to Al-Qaeda, received training in Afghanistan, is probably a group that is supported by the intelligence services of Pakistan. So India is sometimes attacked, and you have this tension, this everlasting tension between India and Pakistan. And this is based mostly on the partition question. When the British owned or ruled India, it included it included Pakistan, included East Pakistan, which was Bangladesh. And then you had the partition. The British experienced trouble, overstretching. You had the Second World War. They couldn't uphold their empire. You had internal events, developments in India. And you had an independence movement. And in 1947, the British really gave up. But the trouble we see now, and we've seen ever since 1947, is that, the separation is not done cleanly, so to speak, in an ethnic, religious point of view. So, in particular, the Kashmir area, you had Pakistan was a Muslim country. India was supposed to be a secular country, although Hindu dominated, and with a large Muslim minority, a really large Muslim minority. And Kashmir, India got a part of Kashmir that was inhabited by Muslims, and that's really the Kashmir issue, which has led to numerous wars, everlasting tension, which we've seen as recently as this year with a militarized situation up in Kashmir. And this group, Lashkar-e-Taiba, they were one of many groups whose ultimate goal was to bring back Kashmir, as they put it, to Pakistan. Or alternatively, have an independent Islamic Kashmir. So that's the background to this story. And then you had an attack in 2008, which I can see if we go to the map. Mumbai is here. It's a really large city in India. It's a business hub. It's a main business city in India. So terrorists came by boat from Karachi in Pakistan. Probably, as I said, aided by the ISI, which is the intelligence services of Pakistan, which has a tradition for sponsoring or helping, aiding some of these militant groups. Because the ISI is heavily focused on the security situation and the conflict with India. So probably aided, although Pakistan never acknowledges that, probably aided by the Pakistan state. They came by boat to Mumbai, several people, several terrorists, and then they wreaked havoc in Mumbai for 3 days, attacking hotels, restaurants, and these luxury hotels. And if we jump back a bit, it's this picture here from Mumbai, and it's news coverage 24 hours a day, and it's massive. They go from, they attack several places simultaneously, and you wonder, when is this ever going to end? It did end eventually, as all such attacks do, but these coordinated attacks, which last for hours and hours, and in this case days, these heighten the perception of risk and of insecurity, and it increases the long-term impact on business and on society. So of course, in this case, it's difficult to measure, but you can talk about $30–40 billion for India's economy. It cost India. Business ground to a halt. Is this all this, questions? Is this the start of something more terrible? Are India and Pakistan going to war again, which they have done numerous times? You had, as I hinted, to a militarized situation earlier in this year, and the downing of a fighter jet up in Kashmir. And you had militarized or military threats by both parties before things calmed down. And this is certainly an event that can cause something more dramatic. Interstate militarized conflict, interstate war even. So that's the background to this story. Business ground to a halt, and you had huge tourism impact. And these kinds of attacks, they create fairly long-term effects on tourism, on tourists' willingness to actually go to a place where you recently had a terrorist attack. You're unsure about, will this be is this a one-off, or is this the start of something that will be continuous? And it's depending on the severity of the attack, the sophistication, the news coverage. The tourism sector is often heavily negatively impacted for a year or 2 years. That happened in Sri Lanka in April 2019. Impact on business, impact on tourist arrivals were significant. Cut in half for the next year, and it takes several years to get it running. And now Sri Lanka, people are, to a large extent forgetting, that these things happen. The government, and this is kind of a key here, the government, the state has to reflect confidently and credibly that they are in control, that this is a one-off attack. So what happened in Easter 2019 in Sri Lanka was pretty much the same thing as in Mumbai. You had several coordinated attacks against hotels, in this case also against Catholic churches. And it turned out it was a local group, probably with links to the Islamic State, but it was a jihadist local or national group belonging to Sri Lanka. So it was less of a case of global terrorism or transnational terrorism, although it had some of these elements as well. And it lingers on. The question is, does the government have control over the situation? Is what happens in the Easter of 2009 a one-off, or is it something that we will have to expect? Because you don't go on a beach holiday to Sri Lanka if you expect that the risk of being attacked by terrorists is large. So the terrorists manage to actually create a psychological effect on domestic society that hurts the economy, that polarizes to a degree, at least as happened in Sri Lanka, polarizes society. And the group manages to fulfill some of these, at least intermediate goals. Even though, ultimately Sri Lanka doesn't collapse, India doesn't collapse, you don't have a war between Pakistan and India, you don't have a renewal of the civil war in Sri Lanka. This had nothing actually to do with the gruesome civil war that preceded this event by some years. And for the sake of examples, you have other fairly recent hotel attacks. Some are listed in this article, which was written before 2015. So I have more recent example. You had an attack in Sousse by the beach in Tunisia, a Spanish hotel chain. News story from that Tunisia attack. What happened? Gunmen arriving from the sea and starts, killing people who are guests at the hotel in question. And for Tunisia, that was a catastrophe in terms of tourism. I mean, one of the stable, or highlighted as the stable country following the Arab Spring. Fairly democratic country with stability and the possibility of attracting tourists. Then something like this happens, and again you ask yourself, is it safe to go to Tunisia? And you answer that, no, it's not safe. Most people would say. So for 1 year, 2 years, perhaps 3 years, Tunisia's tourism sector is in big trouble. And it has started in recent years to recover because Tunisia has not had a wave of such attacks. They've had a couple, 2 or 3. But these are symbols. These attacks are symbols whose psychological effects are often far more important than the attacks themselves, seen from the perspective of the terrorists. Then you had a 2015 hotel attack in Bamako in Mali, Radisson Blu, where you had Chinese workers. And this is one thing the Chinese are more sensitive and more cognizant about, that the economic expansion, the fact that Chinese companies are spread around the world to an ever larger extent, means that they will experience such things as in Mali. And this is the news story from the Mali attack, 20 dead after terrorist raid on the hotel. Then you had a couple of incidents in Hurghada in Egypt, also a beach holiday place by the Red Sea, beautiful place. And then the tourism sector, as Egypt is actually used to from the 1990s, tourist sector sometimes get into trouble for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years because of these attacks. And you get the sense that Egyptian authorities do not have complete control. In particular, further northeast in the Sinai Peninsula, which is, if we go to the map again, Hurghada is here, and then you have a severe security situation in the Sinai Peninsula, and there you also have one of the hotspots for tourists, Sharm el-Sheikh, which is and the area is sometimes, attacked, not often. But you had a few years ago a Russian airliner flying tourists back from Sharm el-Sheikh to Russia. It was blown up. Terrorist attack inside a job. Somebody at the airport aided the terrorist. And the Russians lose, 300 of their citizens. And they don't send their citizens back to Egypt. It started happening a year ago. They started sending back after 4 years of boycotting Egypt, and a lot of other countries were quite hesitant to continue flying to Sharm el-Sheikh. So, and then you had the 2018 attack against Hotel Intercontinental in Kabul. This was one, and it was a Norwegian academic, Arne Strand was his name. He was
the death toll from a hotel shootout in Kabul jumping from 5 to 30 on Monday, and Afghan officials say the final number may be even higher.
Soldiers. But Kabul is, of course, a difficult place. Afghanistan has had a war for, well, more or less since the mid-1970s. You had the January 2019 Nairobi attacks in Kenya. Maybe I don't have that on the news. You had 2019 Gwadar, Pakistan attack, Pearl Continental Hotel. That involved, again, a lot of Chinese, or this is one of the main areas for China in terms of their so-called Belt and Road project, this enormous expansion of economic activities by Chinese companies abroad. Pakistan has a key role here because the Chinese are building infrastructure leading to the port of Gwadar, which is here. A hugely important port for the Chinese and en route to the Persian Gulf also. But this port in Gwadar is situated in an area where you have an independence movement, Balochistan in Pakistan. And one such group was responsible for that attack. So again, the Chinese have to consider these issues, these problems, and there are many of them. When it comes to, the more economic expansion you have, the more difficult areas you enter into, and the more you will experience geopolitical risks. And finally, a few days ago, a couple of weeks ago, you had an attack in Mogadishu in Somalia, which is also of course, a place where it has happened before. And as a tourist, and not many tourists go to Somalia, to be fair, a lot of business people, there are still a lot of business people, they live in this quite fashionable hotels, heavy security, but it doesn't matter sometimes that it's heavy security, because the terrorists, in this case the Al-Shabaab movement, manages to find a way to attack irrespective of the security sometimes. So if we continue, we of course have to ask the question, why are luxury hotels attacked? And they seem to be a prime target often for these such groups. Well, one thing is that they're symbolic targets of Western affluence or Western money, Western riches, and Western influence. And the symbolism in terrorism is quite important. And I have to stress the point again that it's not only the attack itself, it's not the goal, the objective of killing people, certain individuals. It's more a case of killing people, attacking a symbolic target, and creating a lot of additional effects, indirect effects. And if you can manage to hit the typical Western targets, these international hotel chains are most of them are owned by Western companies, then you really succeed at least at an intermediate level. One issue for the groups is that they often, of course, kill, their co-nationals. And jihadist groups kill Muslims in many of these attacks. One spectacular attack with many casualties in Jordan for a few years back, that led to real anger in the country, because most of the victims, by far most of the victims, were Muslims, and it also creates some soul searching in some of these groups. Is this, the correct, and a philosophical religious debate among some of these groups? Is this the correct way of proceeding? Is it okay to kill Muslims, fellow believers, even if you also simultaneously punish the Western hotel companies? Okay, secondly, there are soft targets. They're not usually too difficult to attack. And this is kind of the topic for, in a risk management perspective, for this article. But most hotels are fairly soft targets. There's a limit to how much you can protect a hotel, a luxury hotel, without, the tourists getting a sense of we have entered a war zone. You can't have heavily, armed guards everywhere at the breakfast table and all that. And the rewards are huge. Not necessarily the end objective, the end reward, about overturning the society, about gaining territorial control or political influence. But at least you gain attention, and you gain the possibility of polarization, and you gain news coverage, and which can in turn attract new recruits. Islamic State was hugely successful in that respect. Some of these gruesome, horrible attacks, they created a snowball effect, and potential recruits see that, okay, they're the group of the future. They are the future. They're a success. Let's join them. But psychologically, you damage the country you're supposed or seeking to damage. Casualties, panic, media attention. While these types of spectaculars have rarely succeeded in winning the terrorists' concessions, you don't get the ultimate, you don't win in the bargaining context with the government, for instance, because you can't, give in to terrorists. If you start doing that, the snowball effect ensures that you get more and more attacks. You get an added incentive for attacks. So many countries officially state, and the Israelis do that most explicitly, that we don't give in to terrorist demands. And the alternative is to give in to some demands, which in fairness the Israelis sometimes do, but they don't do it officially. it's very rare for countries to do that officially. Sometimes they do it covertly. But if you give in to these demands, you increase future problems. But these attacks tend to cause both great harm to countries' collective psyche and economic disruption. So you get, it's a success. It can be a success in that respect. The Mumbai attacks, the 2019 Sri Lankan attacks, but ultimately, at least the latter one in Sri Lanka, ultimately it doesn't lead to that much. The ultimate objective isn't reached, whatever that is from the point of view of the terrorists. Thereby support the terrorist strategic aim of bankrupting the United States and its allies. The real ultimate aim. Get the United States to withdraw from the Middle East, for instance. Ultimate aim. Or overturning the regimes in the Middle East, gaining territorial control like the Islamic State did. But if you see, if you take Al-Qaeda, they want the United States out of the Middle East, the greater Middle East. And they want new regimes. They don't want these old kingdoms and authoritarian regimes. They want a caliphate. They want themselves to govern by Islamic principles and the Quran. And of course, these aims and objectives are extremely difficult to realize in the space of one's lifetime. So for some of these groups, they say quite clear it's a long-term prospect. Al-Qaeda does that quite explicitly. Islamic State less so. They're kind of less patient and officially as well. But now they have been beaten more or less in the core area of Syria and Iraq, and they have entered into a more patient zone, patient strategy, long-term project. A fourth cause is the decentralization of terrorist groups. They have the decentralization, the cells operating often quite independently of the organization's central hierarchy. And often you have limited capabilities. So you can't institute too complex attacks that are too complex, like 9/11. And even 9/11 was, in budgetary terms, a low-cost affair. It was a high-cost affair for Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, but that's because they have very little money. Far less money than, for instance, a NTNU have far more money. Their budgets are far bigger than these terrorist groups. And these local cells, they don't have money often. So you go to soft targets, low-cost attacks, but with high rewards in terms of casualties, panic, and media attention. So, Marriott International is the hotel chain in question that is the focus when the authors discuss security risk management. So they review some of these thoughts and experiences that Marriott has had, because Marriott has experienced several terrorist attacks in Indonesia, in Islamabad, in Pakistan, and elsewhere. And when Marriott and when other hotel chains internationalize, they have to have some sort of security risk management in their thoughts. Crisis management teams. In terms of Marriott, they have a 3-tier threat warning system, which they separate between different threat levels: blue, yellow, red. Blue is sort of screening in some areas where it's not, any indication of any terrorist attacks but still some sort of security issues. You screen people, you take their ID, etc. And then you have the yellow label, where it is, you know, a continuous risk of something happening, not something particular, but a general risk. And then you increase, you beef up the screening, the security system. And then you have the red code, which is you have reason to suspect that there might be an immediate attack, which is often the situation in places like Somalia, Mogadishu, or in Kabul in Afghanistan. Because of the security situation, you have to be extra well prepared, and then you have to institute all these measures to protect people, because it's a killer for the hotel chain and for the tourism sector in that spot, in that city, in that country, if something succeeds, if the terrorists succeed. Target hardening is of course necessary, but sometimes not sufficient. Barricades, blast walls, but it makes things harder for the terrorists, and that's an issue. You know, they go after soft targets, and the harder you make, the more likely they are to choose something else as a target. And that's really what happens when you increase security on airports and on airliners after 9/11. You make them into hard target. It's quite difficult to do anything against a plane now. So then, and it was much easier before, and some Palestinian groups in the 1970s, they loved hijacking airplanes because they were really soft targets. There were a lot of security issues. Normally, that's not the case now, so you choose other targets. So it's the same, you know, with people installing an alarm in a area with high crime rates. Or a car alarm, because car thieves or people who are burglars, they choose the softer target. Okay, uniformed plainclothes security guards, non-disclosure of building diagrams. The terrorists in Mumbai, Pakistani group, they had studied these building diagrams beforehand, because you have to know, or you prefer to know, where to move, how to move, where things are, exits and stuff. So publishing these building diagrams make it easier for the groups. And then you have insider jobs, which is a huge problem. The Sharm el-Sheikh attack, which was at an airport or against a plane, bomb smuggled into a plane. So it was not a hotel attack, but it's the same principle. If you get an insider here, you have a problem. If the Islamic State, as was the case in Sharm el-Sheikh, manages to place one person within that airport with responsibility for screening luggage, then something like that can happen. And it's the same case with hotels. You can get these sort of situations. Employees need to be trained. Buildings need to be designed not only with, you know, beauty and flashy things in mind, but also with security in mind. Things need to be coordinated with local stakeholders, not least the police and sometimes also the intelligence services. The response coordination in Mumbai in 2008 was terrible. The internal review in India was concluded that a lot of things went wrong when it came to the response. It came to the quality of weapons, the ease of coordination, communication. So Indian authorities learn a lot from that happening. And one response team, special soldiers, were flown in from very far away. Actually, India is a big country, and the nearest base for these specially trained anti-terror police or forces it was far away, so it took them a long time to actually reach the conflict area, terrorist area. Inter-industry cooperation between hotel or among hotel chains is also necessary from a security risk management perspective. So that concludes the part 3 of this lecture. So I'll take a short break and get back to you.